Hey, welcome to Through the Noise. I'm your host, Ernesto Glucksman. My next guest has been on the show several times. He's probably one of my favorite guests to speak to about infectious disease and climate change. He brings an incredible understanding about COVID, how it transmits between humans to humans, but more importantly, humans to animals, and how it can impact systems, migrations, economic models, agriculture, a whole wealth of information in this man's mind. So we went a little bit long, but I think there's just a lot here for people to listen to that would be valuable and useful in understanding the way the world is trending. This pandemic we just got through, it's not really over. It was a shot across the bow. There's a lot worse possible outcomes that are still out there, other threats. On the other hand, Dr. Brooks brings a great perspective on our resilience and our ability to overcome this emerging world of infectious disease. So let's just jump into it, and hope you enjoy the episode. Dr. Daniel Brooks, thank you for coming on the show again. Third, fourth, fifth time. You're just our resident professor of the show now.
well, thank you. It's good to be back.
Where have you been? Before I started getting into the questions like that, I just want to make sure those of you that don't know Dr. Brooks, you are a professor at University of Toronto. You're a senior research fellow at H.W. Manter of Parasitology. You know a thing or two about viruses and parasites, bugs, the things that are invisible, not just what happens to the body, but how it affects entire systems, public health, and so forth. And then you are also currently in Budapest, right, with the Hungarian Academy of Science, working on standing up an early alert system for infectious diseases. So you're the guy. You can tell us a lot. As far as I'm concerned, you're my primary source for everything COVID related. These are really interesting times. We have a war happening in Ukraine. We are in the US, at least, it seems like we're exiting the stages of COVID. I'm putting air quotes because it hasn't. I don't know. I don't feel the vibe that it's totally gone, but I guess since we're going into springtime, the rates are lower. But anyway, Dr. Brooks, you've been paying attention to a lot of different aspects of this stuff. So why don't we start on, when you came on the show, guests started coming on the show, you were talking about humans infecting non-humans.
That's correct. So 2 years ago, the first time we talked, one of the things I warned about at that time was I think I mentioned that some colleagues of mine and I had realized that something that looked like SARS was happening in China in October of 2019. That's when we found out about it. And we tried to get various levels of public health organizations, all the way up to the World Health Organization, interested in this. And their official line was that this is nothing, the Chinese have it under control, and it's nothing worse than like the flu. And we warned that if air travel was not stopped then in October, that the virus would be circulating globally by December and there would be a pandemic. And we were told that we didn't know what we were talking about. So by January of 2020.
Wait. Let me stop you there. Who told you didn't know what you were talking about?
Well, basically,
did they know you? They know Dr. Brooks.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. There's a difference in the minds of public health people. There's a difference between a PhD in biology and an MD in anything.
Okay.
And the last person that they're going to listen to is a PhD in biology, because what do we know?
Okay.
We don't have an MD. So mostly it was
hold on. That's the thing that really that's very strange to me. you would expect an MD to know what they don't know, right? Because they rely on specialists and so forth. Why wouldn't they then go to the guy with the PhD in biology?
Well, this has to do with very poor training on the part of the medical profession. I mean, MDs are not trained as scientists. In the popular parlance, everybody thinks that doctors are scientists, and they're not. They are more like auto mechanics than they are like scientists. And the reality is that their training is very focused and very limited. So, for example, the primary philosophical basis for medical practice is something called do no harm. Now, do no harm means in an era of emerging diseases, that means wait until there's a pandemic and then try to cope with it.
Right. There's no problems unless you have symptoms. There's no problems unless you have a problem.
And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is to move the discussion from crisis response to prevention. Not just because it would make a difference in terms of the health of people and crops and livestock, but also because it would be more cost effective. We all know that you go to your physician, your family physician, and he says, or I do, and he says, you've got two choices. You can change your diet and lose weight, or we can wait for you to have a heart attack and do coronary bypass surgery. Okay, now which one is better for your overall health, and which one is better for the economic foundation of the public health system?
Yeah. I mean, just reflecting on my own experiences with the doctors that I've had, it's not, I ask them questions like, I want them to tell me how to optimize my health, how to improve my health, how to, whatever I need to be doing to get, and that seems to be like where it all kind of, just, they have just wrote answers to it. They don't seem to really know themselves. It's just not
right. Exactly.
It's a missing component. So then this kind of thinking also then reflects when you have a major public health crisis like a pandemic, right?
And individual physicians, depending on where they're trained in the world, they're trained to recognize and treat known symptoms of known diseases. So no clinician is prepared for a new disease to pop up. So for example, there's a parasitic disease that infects blood cells called Chagas disease. It's very common in Central and South America. It has been known, well, let's say for the last 30 or 40 years, it's been moving north in the US. And it turns out that one of the non-human hosts that can carry Chagas disease, now it's actually transmitted by a biting bug, but one of the non-human hosts that can carry it is armadillos. And armadillos now, when I was a graduate student 50 years ago, armadillos were only in the extreme southern part of the United States. But armadillos are now as far north as Lincoln, Nebraska.
Wow.
And that means there's a possibility of a family physician in Kearney, Nebraska, having a farmer come in who has never been in Latin America in his life, exhibiting symptoms of Chagas disease, and the family physician will have no idea what's going on because they haven't been trained. If they're really with it, they will send that person to Omaha to the medical school where there's a tropical medicine unit, and they will figure it out. But after that happens, there's time and expense and dislocation and all of that, because we're not training our physicians to expect the unexpected. And during a period of climate change, that should be always at the front of our minds. So I remember in January of 2020, this was a month before the World Health Organization actually admitted there was a pandemic going on. The deputy director at the time of emergency response of the World Health Organization had a press conference in Geneva assuring everybody that there was no problem. And at one point he said, well, SARS appeared from nowhere and then disappeared forever. And that's probably what will happen with this. And that's an indication of how poorly trained in basic science physicians are. Because pathogens don't just appear from nowhere, and they don't disappear forever.
Okay. So circling back to where we are with COVID and how it's been jumping between hosts. So
Right.
what's the latest there that you and
Well,
your colleagues
the latest story is that we have, among other things, our research group has a very specific mathematical modeling platform that we use for assessing things like new variants that are showing up. And when Omicron showed up, when genetic sequences of Omicron were first published, and we could put them into our model, we could see that very clearly it was showing the signature of a virus that had gotten into humans from a non-human host. It was not within the range of variants of human variants becoming modified and infecting more humans. So there's sort of a range of variation where all of these human to human to human variants are. And Omicron was way outside of that. So we took that as an indication that someone had, about 2 years ago, at the beginning of all this, someone who was infected with COVID had gone to South Africa and infected some wildlife species. And the virus had sat in that wildlife species for a couple of years, churning off its own new variants, and had managed to come up with a variant that could then go back into human beings. And that's what Omicron is. Now, it turns out that, so we immediately wrote up a short manuscript about this. The editor of Science, the journal Science, rejected it without peer review. The editor of the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science rejected it without peer review. The editor of the Journal of Emerging Diseases, the CDC journal, rejected it without peer review. And the editor of Nature rejected it without peer review. During the time that we were getting these rejections, 2 articles appeared out of China in which 2 different labs in China said, we have noticed that the Omicron sequences show the same kind of modifications that we find in COVID that are maintained in laboratory rats for experimental studies. So we think that Omicron came from a rodent. Now, and there was no publicity about those 2 articles because they also were not published in Science or Nature or the Proceedings or anything. They were in quote unquote second-tier journals. Subsequent to that, the approved story came out, which is, let's blame this, let's combine racism and homophobia and blame it on an African with HIV that's untreated. Then a large study came out of a research group in Spain showing that, because they had looked at all the records of HIV infected patients with COVID, and they published an article saying HIV patients with COVID do not produce these kinds of mutations. They don't produce anything like Omicron. That article also got no publicity because it wasn't in the right journals. So it appears most likely that somebody infected a rodent, some kind of rodent in South Africa, and that rodent produced some kind of variant which has now come back into human beings. And because human beings are moving around, it's all over the planet. Meanwhile, 6 months ago, some people reported that COVID was not Omicron, but another variant, was widespread in white-tailed deer in the United States.
I was just going to bring that up. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Now, just this past week, a study has been published showing that some of the variants that are showing up in the white-tailed deer seem to show indications that they could infect human beings. So one of the next COVID emergences may be called the American variant, or the deer variant, something like that. But the point is that this is never going away.
It's almost like they're being housed in different animal hosts.
Absolutely.
different parts of
Absolutely.
it. And then
Yep.
is it accurate to say that the likelihood of a significant change to the actual virus that it creates a new variant when it jumps from some species to another species, like that it while it's sitting in the rats or the deer, that can modify that thing into something that can be highly
Yeah,
dangerous
that's
to you?
exactly the story. The traditional view was that a pathogen would not jump into a new host until it had magically evolved the ability to do that. And what we've been able to show is that, in fact, many pathogens have the ability to live in more hosts than they normally are found in, because they are usually restricted geographically. But if you have something like climate change, which allows animals to move around, then a lot of pathogens will come into contact with hosts that are susceptible, but they've never been infected before because they never had the opportunity. So that means that
More
what
vulnerability.
gets the pathogen into the new host is a change in opportunity of exposure. Once it's in a new host, then it's in a new environment, and then new variants begin to show up. Now, we can predict, since we know how these things are transmitted and so on, we can predict pretty well the potential for changing hosts given the changing conditions. But we cannot predict the new variants. And that's why prevention becomes very, very important, trying to stop the transmission, because once a pathogen's in a new host, it's going to be producing new variants, and many of those new variants will not cause symptoms in that host, but they could infect something else and make them sick.
Okay. For people that have listened to your episodes in the past, they understand exactly where you are with this stuff. For somebody brand new coming across this episode, you just like probably took them through a whirlwind of concepts that are hard for them to like piece together. So maybe we should zoom out a bit.
Okay.
And just give us the implications, because climate change is what is a major driver in your view, as well as globalization and so forth, because humans travel and so forth. But give us a sense of what are the pestilence pandemic implications when we are shifting the climate zones around Earth, and give us an explanation around that.
Well, yeah, that it turns out that the answer is very simple, but really really profound. What climate change does more than anything else is that it makes species move around. You know, some places get warmer, some get colder, some get drier, some get wetter. No matter what the changes are, the normal response to a change in the local conditions by any species of anything is to move away from the deteriorating conditions. And when that happens, that's when pathogens are brought into contact, changes the opportunity for exposure to pathogens. Some pathogens come into contact with hosts that they've never seen before, but the hosts are susceptible. So, for example, with COVID, SARS-CoV-2, there's a very, very specific little piece of biochemistry on the surface of the cell membrane called ACE2 that is essential. Any cell that has that molecular component, the virus can attach to and infect. And if you don't have that, then the virus you're not going to get infected. And so this is extremely specific. It means this virus is very, very specialized. But it is very specialized on a characteristic that is found in almost every species of mammals on the planet. So it's extremely specific, but it's very widespread. This is something that showed up, you know, at the origins of mammals, and is a characteristic of virtually all mammalian cells. And that means that essentially, given the right circumstances, every single mammal on this planet could be carrying its own version of COVID, which is why when we go and do things like surveys of bats in Western China, we find that there are hundreds of SARS-like coronaviruses in those bats. It's what's happening now is we're just reseeding the planet with another one of these things. But this is actually not strange biology. This is why there are so many pathogens in the world. They're extremely good at surviving.
I'm thinking about just now, as you were saying this, like the California fire. I just got back from California. So I have my mammoth hat on, my new hat. Love that place. But I was thinking about the California wildfires. There was another report recently that in the next, I don't know, decade or so, I could get the numbers wrong, but like 15 to 20% increase in, strength, size, ability to deal with it. I mean, when these forests burned down, you got animals fleeing for their lives all over the place in large, right? And then that brings some of those animals in contact with potential human areas
or livestock,
right? That livestock's is a big one, right?
Livestock and crop disease. This is something that nobody talks about. I mean, almost all of the discussion about emerging diseases focuses on viruses in humans. But in economic terms, viruses in humans are the least expensive pathogens on the planet.
Oh, well, okay.
I mean, they're expensive. They're expensive, but we have to understand that if you look at now, this is before COVID. The data that we had before COVID was that the world was spending in treatment costs and production losses, emerging diseases in humans and in crops and in livestock combined were costing the world about $3 trillion a year.
A year, Jesus.
Which is larger than the GDP of all but 15 countries.
Okay.
And that was before COVID. So in fact, it's not surprising that the global economy crashed with a pandemic that was minuscule compared to the Spanish influenza pandemic.
Because we were so close to the line on our expenses.
Exactly.
With getting agriculture out, getting
that's right. That's right. And one of the ways that we were trying to cope with the fact that the costs, I mean, generally with respect to the costs of food production, producers just roll the cost of disease into prices to the consumer. So we fool ourselves into thinking that everybody's angry because food prices are going up. They're not angry because we're failing to control diseases in our food production.
On that note, you sent me an article about that related to future projections of cost. Like, I mean, this isn't, so if we can count on the fact that climate change, unmitigated climate change is going to continue to impact things, that means disease risk mitigation, emerging disease.
What we found, this article, and it's now been published by the Royal Society Open Science Journal. It appeared a couple of weeks ago now. What we discovered was that if climate change continues, and if we continue to simply operate in crisis response mode to emerging diseases just in food production, and if we don't hide those costs in other things, call them transportation or production or cost to the consumer, if we were honest about the actual costs of diseases, our projections are that by 2080, the cost of coping with emerging infectious diseases in food production alone will exceed the projected GDP of the United States.
Man.
Now, the same kind of argument undoubtedly could be made for things like atmospheric warming and sea level rise and the need to relocate people. All of these different aspects of climate change impacting human beings. So the reality is that we have been kidding ourselves about the economic consequences of climate change for a long time. And this is something I've only become aware of within the last 5 or 6 years because I've been fortunate enough to attend conferences where economists have been talking about this, and they're almost panic stricken. And we get angry because the doctors won't listen to us. They get angry because the banks won't listen to them, and the politicians won't listen to them. There's an enormous amount of frustration on the part of everybody who's doing research in some aspect of climate change right now.
It's like climate change is creating such overwhelming future potential problems that I don't know. It's like when you're overwhelmed, then the only thing you want to do is just crawl in bed and hide, right?
This is such an important insight that's absolutely critical to understand. People like me have to stop assuming that the reason no one is doing anything is because they don't understand how bad the news is. That's not true. They understand. We have made them so aware of the potential problems that now people are paralyzed with fear. And so that's why, instead of talking about, they're all this disease risk and there's this, that, and the other, our focus is there really is good news here, because we know how to prevent a lot of these diseases. We know how to be proactive about the threat of people living along coastlines to rising sea level. We know how to cope with increasing drought and range fires, increasing flooding in other areas. We know how to cope with these things if we decide to do it. There's an additional part of human psychology in addition to denial. It's a very, very old aspect of human behavior, and that is we generally don't respond until it's really obvious that the crisis is right on us. Mm-hmm. So we're smart enough to understand the notion of being proactive, but we don't feel it emotionally. We're not motivated to be proactive emotionally
until something happens, until finally the catalyst,
and then it's too late.
Yeah, to dovetail off your story about the living on the coast, everybody who's living there has some sense of rising costs or potential flooding or more, like they know it's something that's coming. It's not something but it's not happening day to day. The problem with that kind of thinking is if you decide to finally sell your condo in Miami at some point because it's become unbearable, well, who are you going to sell it to?
That's right.
When it's at that level. And if you're if you're waiting until you see your neighbors all trying to sell it, and then suddenly everybody's selling it, at some point, there's going to be a market crash.
That's
where
right.
You're just going to have to leave your asset and walk away because you won't be able to live in it, and no one wants it, right?
I mean, beachfront properties are becoming more and more uninsurable.
I mean, you might as well buy a sailboat because that's where you sink all your money into. But at least you can move the sailboat. You can't move your condo.
I love it. No, that's true. But I've heard. I don't know this. I haven't documented this myself, but I've been told that beachfront property in Miami is now cheaper than property 2 blocks inland.
Wow. That alone should just signal to whoever's down there. It's time, because a New York Times did a massive study around what would be the implications if the coast would have to be shut down and moved inward, and it's not pretty because
that's right.
A lot of people are going to have to find new jobs, new places to live, and where are they going to go? Well, they're going to head to the rural areas. They're going to head to wherever inland, wherever they think they can find a community. And those communities are going to feel the pressure. That's happening in microcosm. It happened during COVID. People moved out of cities, right? And it created these small, quaint little towns that you might buy your second home if you're wealthy enough. It suddenly created traffic jams and people having to wait in line for whatever they never had to do before. Migration is not simple challenge to manage.
Crisis response migration
That's yes.
uh,
Crisis response migration is awful. Can
is
you deal
awful.
with it? Can you deal with it
Yeah,
ahead of time?
that's right. So
Incentivize.
yeah, this is the difference between
Yeah,
what's being called forced retreat versus managed retreat.
right.
Um, and there are, I've been fortunate enough to be involved with some people who are really focusing on this idea of, okay, these big overpopulated cities on the coast are at risk. They're in climate insecure areas. At the same time, there's a problem in many places. There's especially the United States. There's a huge problem with hollowing out the rural areas, the decline of the small towns. Things are falling apart. Blah blah blah. So you have this issue. It's like, oh well, we got too many people on the coast, not enough people in the middle.
Just
What could we possibly do? Okay.
right.
Well,
Right.
okay. So, I mean, that sounds fairly simple, but of course, as you suggested, it's not it's not an easy proposition to do. It's easy to imagine that this could be a solution. So the idea would be the more people that you can um, uh, give a
Incentivize.
good
Yeah.
reason for moving away from the coast now, the more you reduce the chances of a panic with everybody dying when there is a big tsunami or something like that. Um,
Sure.
so for
Or a
example,
market or a full market crash, right? Of
yeah,
the coast.
exactly.
Housing market crashes that suddenly
That's
leave
right.
people
That's
with
right.
their, I mean, there's a lot of people that retire in their homes, right? That are living in these places and their assets is their home condo at the beach or whatever. They're living there.
That's
But
right.
suddenly they can't sell their home. They don't have enough cash because they're on fixed income. What do they do?
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
that's we
Yeah.
could be headed into another economic. I mean, I'm sure that's an economic disaster there.
Well,
Anyway.
yeah. I mean, some people are calling this the new Okies. That they're raising visions of the Dust Bowl from the 1920s and 30s. So the idea that motivates a lot of people is the idea of, in a sense, trying to revitalize some of these rural areas, turn them back into functioning communities the way they were, 2 or 3 generations ago, and not only to revitalize rural America per se, just for its own sake, but also to create places that, in a sense, are pre-positioned landing spots for people who may have to leave the coasts precipitously. So you reduce the number of people who might have to leave, and you give them a place to go. So suppose you're living in a rural town and you don't like anybody from outside, and you say, well, I don't want anybody to force me to allow new people to come in and live in my town. Okay, that's fine. But you have to understand that if there's a lot of space in your town because you've kept all these other people out successfully, if there is a forced retreat, if there are people who are moving away from the Atlantic coast into the Appalachians, or people moving from the Pacific coast into the Rockies and into the Great Basin, that your options for deciding who's going to settle in your town go to zero at that point. You are going to be faced with panicked people who will, do anything they can to save their families at that point. So you cannot manage a panic.
No, right. Yes, if when it gets to a level of that,
Yeah,
yeah. You just see a swarm of human beings coming in that have to
that's right.
find a new
That's
place to
right.
live.
Yeah,
And what are you going to tell somebody who's
yeah.
home, doesn't have a home, where
That's
they should
right.
settle?
That's right.
Like, good luck
And
with
then
that.
these,
But
these smaller communities have a lot of the idea of these smaller, functioning communities. There are a lot of very positive things. For example, in my area with emerging diseases, it's a lot easier in a small town to recruit, grandkids and grandparents to wander around looking at things. Teach them, look for this, look for this. If you see this show up, then take a photograph of it on your cell phone and upload it to this identification place, because that may be an early indication of an outbreak. It may be an early indication of conditions that could lead to a disease outbreak. These are much easier to do in smaller communities. I mean, really, it's impossible to do that in New York City. That's
Right.
why New York, big cities like New York sort of lurch from one oh my God discovery to another. Like all of these strange COVID variants that are showing up in the wastewater system in New York City. Where are they coming from? Well, we now know that COVID can live in raccoons and squirrels and rodents and
At the
all of
dog
these
park.
heavily dogs and cats, deer, all of these heavily urbanized skunks, these heavily urbanized mammals. They're all little petri dishes, and unfortunately, making a nice incubator system for these pathogens that are in wildlife that can also infect human beings, creating urban green spaces and more greenlands, more and more park space within big cities, it simply increases the disease risk. And nobody talks about there are all these benefits of having green spaces within the big cities, but there are also the downside that nobody really talks about, one of which is that that's where the diseases hang out.
I see. It's almost like keeping New York the cement high-rise experience that it is might be actually better than suddenly creating more green spaces that could bring in other animals.
Yeah, except that we also know that psychologically human beings do very, very badly in an all concrete environment. Right. So, and these are this is sort of the paradox or the conundrum that led people to start saying, maybe we should start thinking about having, instead of having, big centralized cities, maybe we should have cooperating networks of smaller cities.
Distributed, yes, but go to distributed
model. They're capable of working with each other,
right,
and thereby maintaining the benefits of a big city, but without consolidating in such a way that they recreate the problems of big cities.
Right. I mean, I was hoping in some ways that the COVID pandemic would at least make this type of experience where we're recording in different places and still being able to communicate without having to get together, like make that the common din of business where you can, right? Not all jobs can do this, but
sure.
Why get on a plane, fly over, go into a studio to tape something like this? We could just push let's just get it right on. Like, why do we need all that other stuff, right?
And it seems that we've discovered that the people that I'm involved with have discovered that there are a large number of small communities that are trying out all sorts of variations on that theme. In fact, there are a lot of this whole rural revitalization movement is actually huge, and it's been unrecognized. The magnitude's been unrecognized because it's mostly a bunch of small towns saying, we're not going to wait to ask permission from the state or the federal government or anything. We're just going to do this. Mm-hmm. We're going to figure out what we'd like. We're going to figure out how to make it happen, and then we're going to do it.
Yeah. Imagine that city planning, concepts.
So it's, and that to me, that's a very, very positive kind of thing. This is something that we can do that has a lot of potential benefits to it, and could a lot of potential benefits right now that could also alleviate problems down the road that we see coming.
Oh yeah. I mean, in every crisis, every problem, you can fixate on the problem and have your panic attacks about it and whatever, have your reactions, but you could also fixate on the people that suddenly are rushing in to address it, and
Right.
the efforts and the heroic efforts associated
Yeah.
with that. And I think we should, that's part of the show. I'm trying to elevate those voices into
Yeah.
this,
Yeah.
because I think it's important for people to know that there's still possibilities to do something about it and
Right.
to
Right.
address it. And it's actually, and it's happening. So
Yeah.
it's not the end of the human story, just thinking about climate change. I think there's some of that in the world. There are a lot of people just sort of resigning to, oh, it's all hopeless, why do anything, that nihilistic kind of approach. And I think they're just as bad as anybody else who's just actually polluting the environment and just causing more problems for climate change mitigation, right? They're on the same
We
level.
say that this is not the time to panic, and it's not the time to give up. This
Right.
is the time to be pragmatic, focused, and just cope with the problem, deal with
Right.
the problem.
Right.
So with the rural revitalization, for example, there seem to be four different ways this can happen. One is that there's a federal government program that comes in and says, here's what's going to happen to your town. Okay. Nobody wants that.
Those
Okay.
work so well.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Another version is, instead of we're the federal government, we're going to tell you what to do, it is we're a corporation.
Oh,
And we'd like to buy your town.
yeah. They do that. Some of those can do that. The Mark
You betcha.
Zuckerberg Facebook
Yeah,
company.
exactly. The third one is what's called gentrification.
Oh,
We're a bunch of rich retired people. We like your town. We're going to come in and we're going to buy a property, and we're going to boost property values. And the city council is going to love that because they get all of this short-term boost in property tax revenue.
yes.
Except
But
that
your family members won't be able to
enough,
find housing.
there you go. As soon
Young
as
kids
there are
won't be able to
enough of
live
these
near
rich
you.
people there, they began demanding services. And there's no housing for the service providers, for the blue collar workers.
Yeah.
And of course, the gentrified people do not want those kinds of people living in their backyard. So they would like them to live somewhere else and then come in and service them in their town. That doesn't work. And so the fourth option is self-determination. The people in the community get together and say, what do we want to do? What would we like? How would we like to have a functioning community? What kinds of people do we want? What kinds of specialists do we need? Who's going to run the solar farm? Who's going to operate the internet office? Who's going to run the water and sewer? Who's going to, this sort of thing.
By the way,
this and this.
None of that is easy either, but it's it's the one that has probably the best outcomes for your community if you get involved in that at that level, right?
Exactly.
The best outcomes for you personally, the best outcomes for your neighbors. So it's sort of like that is probably the model like, given the three other options. Yeah, this is the one.
Yeah, there's sort of there's kind of a 3-generation model in this. Okay. So basically, a lot of these small communities that are dying are full of people my age and older. Okay. And the only virtue we've got is that we've seen a lot of life. Okay. So we've got experience. So that group of people becomes the sort of the trusted advisors, the council of elders for this little town that wants to revitalize. And they say, all right, here's what we need. Here's what we would like. The people that they want to recruit are young families. They want to bring the young parents in who will invest their lives in that community, raise their kids there, and the benefits of that kind of rural revitalization will not show up until the grandkids. Okay, the grandparents, the people who are grandparents now who get this initiated, they're going to be gone. The parents will be grandparents by the time their children begin to benefit from a revitalized community. 2 generations, 2.5 generations, that's about as much time as we have
to get on. Yes.
To get our blankety blank together.
Right. Right. And when when I look at statistics, when I look at projects, I mean, projections for they cite 2050,
Hmm.
2080,
Hmm.
and 20, at the century mark, all of those things, you're projecting it way into the future that we're just notoriously difficult to actually pin down. We don't
Right,
actually
right.
know what have we done now that might adjust some of those projections, or what is coming
Hmm.
around the
Hmm.
corner, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But also, if we don't do anything, it's not like you can, if you're, you're in your 50s or 40s and you're thinking, what am I going to care about 2060? Well, if
Right,
if nothing actually happens, you're going to be carrying sooner than you think. It's going to impact your lifestyle, your work,
right.
whatever it is you're doing. You're going to feel it.
Yeah.
And I think this pandemic, the the thing that I was I started to get concerned about was just sort of pinning the blame on a country,
Right.
China, Wuhan,
Yeah,
that
exactly.
lab.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
it'll never happen again because we blamed some group of people.
yeah, right, exactly.
So can you give us a sense in terms of the potential pandemics you guys have been keeping an eye on, and you've been to many of the other ones around the
Hmm.
world?
Hmm. Hmm.
You use the word, I think it was on mic. I don't remember. Maybe it was off mic, but you used that COVID was kind of a shot across the bow. It
Yeah, yeah,
wasn't as bad as it could
that's
as bad
right.
as it could be, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If COVID had been of the same magnitude as the Spanish influenza outbreak, we would be talking about 750 million dead people, not 7 million. Okay.
10,
And
10
so
times
there are,
more, a seventh of the global population, right?
right, exactly, exactly. So, or a tenth. There are pathogens in the world that we know about that could potentially cause problems if they get moved around. There are pathogens in the world that are related to ones which we know cause disease, but they haven't caused any disease yet that we know of. But because they're related to things that cause disease, we ought to be worried about them. So, for example, everybody knows that dengue fever causes a bad disease. Not very many people knew that a relative of dengue called Zika could cause real problems also. And so we were blindsided by that. We weren't prepared. And um, the more we know about the diversity of pathogens on the planet and how they're transmitted, the better able we are to anticipate where they may go under climate change. And that should allow us to take steps to mitigate the possibility that they can be transmitted when they move into a new place. We can slow them down from getting in there. We can make it less likely that they'll cause disease in a new place if we know it's coming.
Do we have some kind of international standards around like the likely, like, categorizing some of these um some of these pathogens in terms of like likely impact, likely to spread? I mean, do we have some sense of some prioritization thing? I mean, it did seem like COVID just came out of nowhere, but it's not like we weren't aware of coronaviruses
Yeah, no,
in animals
exactly.
and stuff.
They're yeah, I mean, the story of COVID is a terrible, tragic story of mismanagement of something that could have been 100% prevented. And COVID, the original SARS outbreak was 2003 to 2004. In 2005, there were two different articles published by two different labs in China. One of them published in Science, saying, we've discovered a whole lot of SARS-like coronaviruses in bats in Wuhan. Given the live animal markets in Wuhan, this represents a potential threat. And we really ought to be looking into that. And the Chinese government built a laboratory to begin investigating that possibility in 2018.
To get enough evidence, right? To sort of
just to begin studying the implication from articles 13 years before. And they were overtaken by events. They had waited so long that by the time they started, it was not surprising that something emerged while they were getting set up. But the coincidence in time between the bureaucratic lag before taking action and the emergence of something that was predicted in a general way, that's what fueled all of these conspiracy theories about it being a laboratory.
That's what started. It's a military project.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And it was not. It was even worse, because it was a matter of just bureaucratic inefficiency. There was no
bureaucratic negligence. Let's just call it that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you take too long, you cause negligence, right?
That's exactly right.
Eyes and cross your T's.
And so it tells us how easily these things can get out and propagate if we're not careful, if we're not paying attention. So the real story has nothing to do with the Andromeda strain and viral warfare and all this sort of crap. It has to do with the fact that the natural history of pathogens makes them incredibly good survivors. They're extraordinarily opportunistic. You give them the opportunity, they're going to find appropriate real estate to live in. And once they get into a new host, then they're going to start producing variants in ways that are not predictable. So if we're not doing prevention and surveillance ahead of time, then we cannot be ahead of the curve. We're reduced to only crisis response. And that's we've now shown, I think, fairly conclusively that that's not sustainably, it's unsustainably expensive.
Once it gets out of hand, right?
Yes.
Once it breaks,
you let it get out of hand. But I mean, this is our everyday experience. You let your credit card debt get out of hand, you're in deep trouble.
Right. You neglect that nagging pain in the back of your body for too long, and suddenly you realize, oh, that's that's a tumor, something. No,
that's right. And it's very interesting, that the medical profession has adopted a credo of prevention. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure for everything except infectious disease, because they've convinced themselves that these things cannot be predicted. And that was one of the breakthroughs that we made, was saying, no, that's actually not true. And because our perspective describes what's really going on, we can say it's a bad news, good news situation. The bad news is this means that the risk of emerging infectious diseases is enormous. But it also means that because pathogens are moving into a new host based on properties that they already had, we can know what those are, and that allows us to predict what they would do if they had the chance. And that allows us to get in and interdict the transmission, disrupt the transmission, and actually, if not prevent a pandemic completely, at least really mitigate it. Get it under control before it gets out of control.
What are some risk mitigating tactics that you're advocating that should be implemented?
Well, a huge amount of it is public education, and things like and we see these in a lot of parks, for example. Check yourself for ticks before you leave. After you leave the forest, beware of mosquitoes, this sort of thing. Because there are all of these diseases that can be transmitted by various kinds of ticks and mosquitoes and other kinds of bugs and things. Don't drink water out of a what looks like a crystal clear mountain lake.
No,
it's things that our parents took for granted, and we don't pay any attention to, because we've been living in we, quote unquote, people in the United States have been living in an environment that is really very protected and very atypical. So a lot of the things that we would need to teach the average American about people in rural areas of Africa and South America and Asia would go, but of course, how could it possibly be that you don't know this stuff? So it's a matter of taking, known information about how to protect yourself and making it more widely available. So for example, the so-called kissing bugs or assassin bugs that transmit Chagas disease, they're in Nebraska. Armadillos are in Nebraska. Okay, family physicians in Nebraska should be preparing for this now. Kids in their health class in sixth grade should be taught, this is, have you seen this on your farm? Have you seen this on your ranch? If you see these things, be really careful about them because they can transmit a disease. The same way we taught people to be careful about ticks. And so a lot of this stuff is just a matter of applied natural history, because the pathogens are part of natural ecosystems and they just move through the natural ecosystems. They're transmitted by some either actively or passively in a variety of ways. But for each pathogen, the way they're transmitted is very specific. And so we know that. So for example, if malaria suddenly popped up in Minnesota, we would know to look for mosquitoes. We wouldn't waste our time on anything else. We would go right to the mosquitoes of Minnesota, and we would go to only the species of mosquitoes where the female mosquito has to feed on blood 2 times. Okay, some mosquitoes, the females feed on blood 1 time, and they use that blood to nourish their eggs for before and after fertilization. Other mosquitoes feed on blood 1 time to get the eggs ready for fertilization. Then they feed a 2nd time.
And that's the transmission, because you might
that's exactly right. Those are the only ones that can transmit it. Now, mosquito biologists know exactly what subset of mosquitoes we're talking about. And so all you have to do is say, a case of malaria popped up. You get the mosquito biologists, you get the malaria biologists together, and in a very, very short period of time, you know exactly what to look for. And once you find it, you know how to interdict it.
Do we have to also maybe create like some programs to bring these to specialized biologists to hospital centers and give these presentations, and then the hospital centers need to be compelled to respond with actionable efforts? I mean, this idea that an MD doesn't want to listen to a PhD, it's probably, I'm hoping the pandemic has caused that to, correct their thinking on that one. Going in at the early stages of COVID, having to see a doctor because I had some medical health issue, it was scary for me. But what was more scary is it seemed scary. They were in a scary position because they didn't really know what to think about it either.
Exactly.
And I wonder if they would have benefited from talking to folks like you.
Yeah. There are a whole bunch of things that should be done. One of which is a change in the training program for infectious disease specialists. They really need to spend at least a year getting at least master's degree level understanding of evolutionary biology and natural history, and knowing how these things actually operate. But at the same time, you can compensate for, there are all these benefits of being very specialized. And, not every GP would be a good surgeon. Not every surgeon would be a good epidemiologist, and so on. So the benefits, you can get the benefits of specialization without the costs if everybody's cooperating and working together. So ultimately, it's a question of whether you're sort of going out horizontally among specialists, or whether you're going vertically from people in local communities all the way up to specialists. As long as you have information centers where people are coordinating information that's coming in and out and providing results and recommendations out to back to the people that sent the information in, whether it's, hey, we just found this tick in our, on one of our dogs, should we be worried about it? Oh yes, contact so-and-so in your community, and we'll get right on that. Yeah, there are a lot of things that could be done. It would not be cheap, but it certainly wouldn't exceed the GDP of the United States within 70 years to do it.
Right. Paying your credit card bill is not cheap, but the sooner you start doing that, the better
exactly
for your future.
That's right. Yeah. The more, I mean, that's a really, really good metaphor for this, is that not taking action is like accruing compound interest. And the problems are just going to get more and more expensive and more intractable the longer we fail to do something. And many people have already decided that we're past that point and we should just give up and not worry about it. But we're not really past that point. We can still, there's a significant amount that we can still do. Even in the context of knowing that climate change is happening and is going to continue to happen, but we can compensate for that. Knowing what's coming at us, we can compensate for that and survive.
This story that's happening here in this space with infect, it's just been so intriguing to me over the years, and I really appreciate you, Dr. Brooks, for being such a fantastic source, of giving us a sense of what's happening in this world. But I've been also looking at the auto industry lately. I've been really intrigued about the transition there. And it's the same vein of, there's the incumbents, there's the way we used to do things, there's the changing customer sentiment, there's this leading company, Tesla, that's showing that it's certainly possible. What everybody else was saying was impossible, perhaps from a biased perspective. Oh, car batteries are never going to be used, never going to be bought. Why invest? And now they're in a state where there has been a lot of hype for new EV companies, and one major one, Lucid, just downgraded their projections of how many cars they could make, because production is, you can make concept cars. That's the Elon Musk. You can make the concept cars, you can design the cars, but getting it to scale is the hard part.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Right.
Now I have a friend in Asheville, North Carolina, where I live. I have a friend who owns a Tesla, and it's amazing and it's incredible. But here's the problem. Okay, I'm a retired university professor, and my friend turns to me and says, "Dan, just pull out $70,000 or $80,000 and buy a Tesla." And I'm going, Mark, if I had $70,000 or $80,000, there's some home repairs I have to do first.
Right.
And I said, when Teslas are selling for $25,000,
let me know.
Then I'll believe. Conceptually, I understand that this will be an improvement over fossil fuels. It's not a panacea. No, because we're not drilling for oil, but we are mining for lithium.
Sure.
We're not producing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we do have an accumulation of dead batteries that's going to show up.
Sure.
So there's none of these proposals are 100% fixes.
No, but it's the trend that has to happen if you want to reduce the carbon emissions from that, from the energy, from that sector. And if you want to make a compelling argument for revitalizing the energy grid, which, by the way, we need to do because it's so brittle as it is.
Well, this is I mean,
the energy grid alone is terrifying.
One of the things that the COVID pandemic, especially remote learning for kids, one of the things that really exposed was weaknesses in the broadband connectivity. Yeah, there are school systems in Western North Carolina that do not have broadband access. Their kids had no capacity to do
It's just
remote learning.
awful. Yeah.
This is not,
Awful.
and these are, this is something that crosses party lines.
Right. This is our future,
Yeah.
parasitologists, right? This is like we need.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly right. We need access, a basic survival of humanity as an advanced technological species with all the good things that we've got. Survival of that requires that as many kids as possible get access to education, because we cannot predict which one of those kids is going to become the next genius.
Right.
So, investing in our future by investing in our kids' education, it's like buying lottery tickets. There's only one way to have a chance to win, and that is to buy an enormous number of tickets.
Yeah, I keep thinking in my mind when I don't know, at some point I'll be pretty old and I'll be in a hospital full of young kids, and these were the kids that we educated, and I hope they know what they're doing, right? Like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody gets to that point. So
yeah. Well, you've got a doohickey on that red thing that's kind of down around your stomach.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
No, I want more than that.
Yeah. So, yeah, I just think it's the business as usual, no longer a viable reason.
Business as usual is no longer possible.
No, and
inaction is also not possible anymore.
Yeah, you have to figure out a way to contribute. You have to figure out. I'm hoping with this show that this is the way I can do what I can do about it, right? Yeah. But getting this information, getting what you've been saying, Dr. Brooks, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it.
It's a great pleasure for me. I mean, this is my way of trying to help as well.
Right. Through these tough times with this this war outbreak. I mean, it's like, great. And now there's a war breaking out. It's like, Jesus, like, did the world really need that? No, that's not. No, the world never needs a war. But
that's correct. But you know what? My middle stepson here, we're sharing the house here in Budapest. He and a friend of his went down to one of the train stations last night to answer a call for volunteers to help with refugees coming in from Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And he came back and he was so excited. He said there were so many volunteers there. There were more volunteers than refugees. There were every restaurant and food producing operation in the 2-block area of the train station. People were there just giving food to the refugees. People were there with clothes. I mean, there's a big need because it's mostly grandmothers and grandkids who are coming out right now. There's a big need for formula and baby clothes and things like that. And he said it was astonishing, and it made him feel really good about his country. And apparently this is happening all over Europe. It's really something.
That's right. And in every crisis, that's who you should focus on. It's who's helping. Human
beings are capable of great good.
Yeah.
And that's what we just have to have to increase our reliance on that and get as much away from this conflict for the sake of conflict crap.
Yeah. If I can close this episode out on one more point, all the news, I call it scroll media now. I'm not calling it social media. It's not social. Come on, people. There's nothing social about it. It's just scroll media. But I've been going through a diet of blocking that out just into the late evenings once my kids are asleep and just like during the day. Because I found myself started really around the pandemic, and then it was Black Lives Matter. I'd go down these days of consumption of the awful tragedy of what's happening, trying to get time to come to grips with it. But what I realized, it was impacting my own emotional well-being in the community that I have to deal with. I'm responsible for that. I got to deal, and there are problems here that there's nothing I can do about some of the problems on the other side of the planet, in that degree. So we're not in a world where there's not enough information to be informed about things that are happening. There's too much of it that's being optimized to tell you how awful the world is.
Right. I agree.
And the dangers you fall into believing that that's actually what's the reality for the world. The reality for the world, it's not that. Those are the outliers. The reality for the world is what your son-in-law is experiencing when he goes down for a call for volunteers and realizes, oh, there's a shit ton of people that actually care about this.
Yeah.
They just don't make the headlines.
That's right. That's true.
So get out there. Anybody listening, get out there and, do something that'll, bring meaning to your life and help someone else. That's the best part about being a human being, right?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Yeah. And I have, we were talking just before we came on, I have 2 sets of friends, colleagues and their families in Kyiv right now. And, the only thing I know right now is that as of an hour ago, they were all still alive. And that makes that kind of thing really, really brings it home to you, just how stupid wars are, how destructive they are, and how much that destruction ripples out. But at the same time, there has been this astonishing, somehow Vladimir Putin's evil has catalyzed the very best in human nature in response to it. And that means that we humanity has the potential to save itself. We have it within us to do that.
Dr. Brooks, thank you. We'll send it there. It was an hour and a half. Wow.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you guys for listening. Really appreciate it. And if you could share the YouTube channel, because I'm just getting that thing off the ground. That's the one that doesn't have a lot. There's 65 new subscribers, and I appreciate each and every one of you. There's been a few likes. There's been lots of views on some of these episodes. I really appreciate it. If you want to share something of it, grab a piece and send that around. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care and be well.
Visit throughthenoise.us for more episodes and subscribe to our newsletter. This show is produced by Through the Noise Consulting, uniting external communications and internal IT functions to ensure data and privacy are protected while creating innovative communications platforms. Want to start your own podcast? We can help. Visit getthroughthenoise.com to learn more.